record on this computer.
All right, welcome everybody. This is group number 1, consisting of Brandon, Abby, Brittany, Rachel, and myself, Adam. And so first, we thought the most important thing to share is as you do your budget off of the NDE page is the budget timeline. And following this, and no matter what resources you use, as you work through it, following this timeline, having it, knowing it will be a great resource to have. This was one of the first things my superintendent had printed out and him and his bookkeeper talked about just as they go through the budget process. The next thing is always the new superintendent training and orientation that happens in July. One thing that's a common theme throughout our presentation is NDE is very, very helpful. They have tons of resources. They are willing to help out. And also Nebraska is just a sharing state where other superintendents are like that, where you can call and get lots of help. But normally in July is where the bookkeeper training and the superintendent trainings happen. You go to those, it's a lot of information. Both my colleagues said it's a very overwhelming time with so much going on. It's hard to take a bunch of it in, but a lot of agenda items here of what they talk about. And then what I found very helpful too is just the slides presentation without downloading it, but tons of information from the classifications of fund timeline, just that basic knowledge of everything, and just more information here, exactly what everybody needs. This budget text is actually the school budget word for word, exactly what it is. A very boring nighttime reading. If you need help falling asleep, that's what it is. But all of that stuff is there within that first training of stuff there.
So hi, I'm Abby. I'm the Loop City Elementary principal. Like Adam mentioned, it's very easy to get bogged down in all of the budgeting and finance things. And to me anyway, it seems like it's a completely other language sometimes. So we looked at what are the 4 essential things that you'll need, or what are your 4 main tools. So the state auditor page is going to be your best friend with this. You're going to look at that and do your AFR, that annual financial report, the NDE finance page, and the NDE code book. So I think all of us, when we kind of talked, trying to do our research on our own with this, those are the 4 things that we really looked at. And a lot of our superintendents and bookkeepers said that they printed off a lot of those resources, the code book in particular, and really read through that line by line. And like Adam said, NDE is so good about helping out with that. They highlight what are some of the changes that are being made so that you're not going through each individual thing trying to highlight and find everything. But those are going to be the 4 main tools that you definitely want to use going forward.
I think too, we didn't talk about this before when we were visiting, but one of the things, I'm Brandon Marquez. I'm the 712 principal at Elm Creek. When you're in that state auditor's page, you download that school budget from there. Like that's where you download your budget. And one of the really important things is that your number that you start with on your budget matches that number that that you get from the state auditor's page. Like those 2 numbers have to match at the beginning of your year. And sometimes just knowing from having conversations and getting to do the budget with Tom this year, sometimes that's an issue. Them numbers don't match. So when you pull that budget off the state auditor's page, you just have to make sure that your beginning number and their beginning number matches as you develop your budget.
That's a great point. And so that state auditor's page is going to take you to download all materials. You're going to go to local governments, go down to the budget forms and information, and then right here, big orange block, and you're going to scroll down to the school district's budget form. And this is that school budget form that Brandon's talking about. And this is your beginning information here, and all of your prior information. And these are where those numbers are going to have to start to match up, where you start and go from there.
See the Excel sheet. Just
oh,
so
yeah. We got to switch that over here. Just so they can see.
I would say the most anxiety I get is when there's technology stuff going wrong. Now we can see. You're good to go.
Okay, good. Thank you. So this is actually Burwell's one that we used for last time. Thought it would be helpful to have some of that. And a big thing is the checklist at the very beginning of the budget, making sure that you follow those things there. It's up to the top. Your interlocal agreements, obviously. This is where your numbers are going to start to go. We'll talk about things that get published in the paper later on, all of those things, the corresponding pages. I think this was a real important one to look at, where you can't just pick what number that you want to grow by. You have to take the 2% plus your real growth of how much you can grow your budget and do some of those things. So I think this was a really big one to cover. And then as we also get into, this will be in the paper from there, the different types of funds. But as you start to connect the dots of everything with the AFR, you have your actual column D, where you're taking that actual money of those starting numbers that Brandon talked about. Like, those have to match up line for line from that audit. And then as you go to column E, you have your actual estimated, where that's where you're getting information from your bookkeeper of where are you at currently, and then where do you project to finish in that current year. So you are either going to be below or maybe over, and you have a little bit more. And then F is where that's what you are asking for. So that's where you're using your bookkeeper's knowledge with the reports. You're using the AFR and your own research and knowledge to build that budget when you go through there. And just know on these, every decimal point matters. The form builds upon itself. It's going to, where you put in numbers, it populates and goes other places from there. So I'm going to go back to sharing the website here and our information here. So that was the state auditor's page. This for me was again, the checklist I think is very important to have on there when you go through. This one goes in the paper, those funds that we talked about, the 2% real growth. And from here, I'll turn it over to Brandon talking about the ND finance page.
I think too, I'm going to go back to that last slide you had a little bit too. When you set your levy, whatever your levy is, whether it's 92 cents, $1.03, whatever, that understanding that isn't what you get. You have to get your tax asking based on your budget. And there should be a little bit of difference in that. You shouldn't ask for every dollar that you've levied. You should just ask for what you need and have that left in there for extra. I know that's a big confusing thing for the public superintendents to deal with is, oh, you need to lower the levy. You need to lower the levy. Well, we're not asking for all that money anyway. We need to lower our tax asking. And so just understanding that as a piece of that, making sure that there's a difference in that, and understanding the difference between your levy, what you're asking, and your levy for your budget. And I'll talk about the ND finance page. I think the first slide is I talk about coding a little bit. The coding, there's a book. Usually when you talk to most superintendents, they're not super up to date on the codes. Like, they know the funds and all those things are in the line items, but your real expert in this is your business managers. And so in those funds, there's different numbers. The first number is the fund number. The second number is receipt disbursement number. The third number is the function. The fourth number is the object. And then there's a building code. And if you look at this screen right here, like, you have the general fund, depreciation fund. We'll go through. We have someone talking about all those different kind of funds. Not every school uses every fund, and they don't use them the same way, but those are there. And then receipt and expenditures, the 1 versus the 2. I talk about that on my slide a little bit. A 1 is a receipt, a 2 is expenditure. The reason why they have that number in there are several. If you go look at the handbook, there are several different codes that you have to use that are the same number, whether it's a receipt or a disbursement. So that 1 and 2 becomes really important in those instances. In other instances, and talking to my bookkeeper, it's really not that big a deal. Just in those ones where they have the same numbers, to make sure that you code it the correct way and you're putting money in or taking it out as it needs to be. The function is instruction, support services, all those things. Then the last one is salaries, benefits, like how it goes in there. And when we look at line item budgets later, those functions are really numbers are 1,000s, 2,000s, stuff like that. I talked a little bit about the receipts and disbursements. Another thing to really note in coding is when you get the manual, like this year, it's on page 4. The state state posts the changes to the coding, to the numbers every year, and some different things in there. And so just making sure you go in there and you look at those, and your bookkeeper is aware of those and you're aware of those. So things have to be coded different. You can do those. And then there's just more than one way to do it. It's not a cut and dry deal. You know, Burwell, they might code communication for printing, like the copier expenses different than we might code it to a different fund than others. And so there's just really no way to do it. And my business manager, I talk to her, and every now and then they run into something where they're not sure where to code it to. And so they'll call the state, and the state will be like, oh, I'm not sure. And they'll go through different things and they'll say code it. And it kind of reminds, I was talking to my superintendent about it a little bit, and he said sometimes it's an issue because we have some staffing things where our bookkeeper will code it one way one month, and then the next month she'll code it different. And so they have to go back in there and do it. And it's just kind of a weird thing how those things go. So just understanding how those codes work into your budget so you're taking money from the correct place all the time is a really important thing. So any comments on coding?
I think as we get more into it, as you know, we foreshadow for other assignments, the local
Yeah.
coding is huge where,
Yes.
you know, you may break it down by high school textbooks, English for 10th
Yeah.
grade or whatever. So you can make
Yeah.
it as detailed as you want or as general as you want, just depending on what works best for your district.
Yeah, and I forgot to talk about that, but like the building code, like in my district, we don't use the elementary and high school building code. We're in the same building, and you know, the superintendent we have right now says we don't have to do that. The next person, they might say, yeah, we're gonna do that. And I know some of you guys use building codes in your building. So that's just how things are done differently at every school. But the whole idea is to make sure that we're accounting for how we're spending our money in our different funds of our budget. So the next thing I'll talk about is TIOSA. It was developed in 1990 in Nebraska, and it kind of came about because there was there was somebody that felt like there's some disparity in school funding in districts that didn't have the land valuation that they needed. They weren't getting the resources they needed, or they had super high sped needs. They weren't getting those. And so there was a lawsuit, Gould versus Orr, and then it was to eliminate funding disparities came about. And basically the TIOSA formula is what they call it, is basically you take your calculated needs that you have for your district, and then all your resources that you have, you subtract your resources, and that gives you your equalization aid. Some of our districts, and we talked about this a little bit earlier in our group discussion before the recording, is, you know, some of our districts have a lot more land valuation and a lot more taxable valuation than others. And so we don't need that equalization aid. So our needs exceed our resources exceed our needs. And so we don't need that equalization aid. And that's really what that's for, is to take the disparities of some of the communities that don't have that, where their needs are higher than their resources, to make sure they have enough money to function and provide the same educational opportunities for students. Any questions on that? Anyone? No? Okay, there was a lot of changes in 2023. Governor Pillen, I'm new to Nebraska, is Pillen, right? Governor Pillen, there's a big push, obviously, as we all know, to decrease the property tax in Nebraska, because it's one of the highest ones in the nation. And so one of the bills he introduced is to decrease property taxes over time, and they're doing that by increasing funding to education by $2.5 billion through 2030. Some of the biggest things that are changing for our local schools, for all schools, is the SPED reimbursement funding. That increased to 80% this past year. And talking to my mentors, both of them said, you know, that number was kind of a floating number based on how much money they had left is how much you got reimbursed. And a lot of times it was around 50%. So increasing that to 80%, I think that also really falls in line to the demand that we're having for SPED funding in all our schools. Like, we're all seeing way more social emotional needs, way more SPED kids than we did. Not for those of us that are old, we didn't have near as much of this not long ago. And so that funding is going to really help with that. And then they also introduced $1,500 per student funding. This did lower the option student funding. This is a big deal for, like, we're close to Kearney. We get quite a few option students. Amherst gets the really good ones, not Elm Creek, but so you just take in the option funding, they take how many you have that option out. how many have the option in and whatever. If you have more that option in, they give a payment for that. That lowered by about $1,500 with this new funding laws that they came up with. So the $1,500 per student funding really benefits, in talking to my mentors, it really benefited the schools that didn't get equalization aid, because they weren't getting any money because their resources were more than their needs. They're going to get the $1,500 per student, even if their resources are higher than that. So it really benefits them. And then this stuff changes yearly. Tom Moore, our interim superintendent, he said, he was out of the game for 2 years and he got back and he's like, so much has changed. Like, you just got to make sure you ask people and talk to people, because this stuff changes a lot. And I know I can't remember exactly what it was for. I should have asked. I just thought of this, but I remember at a board meeting this year, because of this new funding changes, we had to vote for a 7.5% increase in something, because that no one really knows what that number is going to be moving forward with this, but you had to raise something to 7.5%. I wish I'd have thought of this before. And so I think with all these funding changes, and the reason I said that is just making sure that our boards understand, as we get this information, passing the information onto our boards of, hey, these things are changing in funding, so that they can make the decisions they need to make to help us stay on track financially as a district.
I think that's
Any
the big thing,
questions?
because the governor's already coming out of having people lower the levies even more. And I think if you look at the legislation right now, there's like 20 laws going in place that would impact school budget and the finances and all of that. So, our superintendent's in his second year, and the formulas and the spreadsheets and the way it's done is different from his first year to his second year. And who knows what's going to be that third year. So that's where NDE being helpful and just being up to date with everything plays a huge thing, because the formula does change on a yearly basis.
Yeah.
One of the things that we were supposed to do for this module this week is to talk about the fund classifications and what they are. And Brandon already kind of had a list and how it worked into coding. And I think it's maybe already been mentioned, but I think it's worth mentioning again that not every school has all of these funds, and they can also be used. Well, and that kind of goes with the coding. What Kippahaw codes may not be the same thing as Loop City. So all that just kind of depends. So those are the basic fund classifications there. General fund is the big one that when you talk about school finance, everybody, oh yeah, general fund, that's what that is. But it finances all aspects of your school. And revenues are classified by source, and then expenditures by specific functions. And I think if you think back to that coding sheet, that makes sense when you look at that sheet. The general fund is also limited by TIOSA. As we go through those asterisks will be the ones that are fundable by taxes or taxable funds. Another big fund that my superintendent really talked about was the depreciation fund. And that reserves monies from the general fund, but it's like it's part of the general fund, and it's also restricted by TIOSA. Brandon, you had a point when we were talking earlier about how it's the depreciation fund, so it lessens.
Yes. So when depreciation fund really just takes anything that depreciates, so like vehicles, anything like that, that's how all that money can be spent in there. But I think the big thing with these funds that with TIOSA that we have to know is they set our limits on how much we can have in reserve. So how much. And the formula for that, I'm not sure what the formula is for that. Like you punch the numbers in and it tells you what your maximum number. So for all these funds, because of TIOSA, it says how much you can have in reserve for those things. And so having money in there to make sure that you can replace vehicles, if you have to replace a gym floor or something like that with that depreciation fund, really helps.
And you have to clearly put that in your budget. Like I'm putting $100,000 in the depreciation fund for motor vehicles, or I'm putting 80,000 in for this. You can't just put 600,000 in the depreciation fund and use it for what it comes up with. That's why you have those board planning meetings where you're planning on what you want to do to use that money for.
Yes, that money has to be put in there when you present it has to be set when you present your budget to the public. So there's a lot of planning and prep that needs to be involved in both of these funds. So you can do some of those things, get the reserves in there to get the things you need.
Schools don't need anything.
No,
Um,
just people.
Another one of the funds is the Employment Benefit Fund, and this reserves general fund money for obviously employees. So when we're talking about separation incentive policies or things like that for early teacher retirement, that's where you would put those funds. And again, it's restricted by the allowable reserve by TIOSA. The contingency fund, that's to fund uninsured losses and legal fees. Can't be more than 5% of your total budgeted general fund expenditures. And again, it's another restricted fund. The activities fund, I think a lot of people who don't know much about school finance, that's one fund that we tend to recognize. That includes your student organizations, FFA, student council, all your athletic funds. But it cannot be used to record general revenue or expenditures. If there's a deficit, however, general fund can pay that deficit, but like we were talking earlier, then that money has to be paid back to the general fund.
Yeah, and I think that's where we see most of our deficits will be in activities funds, usually fundraising accounts or something like that. Sometimes school nutrition funds too. So that's probably the place that we got to watch for those the most. And those cannot, when you get audited, they cannot be in the negative or the auditors throw an absolute fit. And so that's one thing to make sure you go through your activities funds to make sure that those are all in the positive. And I know I am the athletic director, so I code all these bills with my bookkeeper. So if you get a chance, like it's a really good opportunity to get some experience doing that stuff with them in a fund that's used a ton, and it's pretty easy to do because like this goes to this comes out of the volleyball account or the volleyball fundraiser account, and see how those code numbers work. So it's if you want some experience, that's a good place to get some experience because they pay bills every week with activities. So.
I think that's one thing on the auditor, like the auditor works for you, the district. So you want to make sure you have that really good relationship and you're clear and you have everything and they're double checking and being involved in that process now for 2 years. I mean, a good audit makes for a good budget and having all of that detail. So just make sure you have that relationship where they work for you so that you can make and provide the best budget for the district.
And they'll help you fix when we talk about these fund classifications. Like sometimes you'll have something in the wrong place and they'll find it and they help you. You just got to make a ledger entry and they'll help you move those to the right place and make sure that things are balancing out with those funds.
Kind of another one of those learning opportunities they provide. And
Yep.
it's kind of like NDE. They're there to help you, not come in and be like, ugh.
Yeah.
Another fund is the school nutrition fund, and that covers all school food programs. Again, the general fund can pay a deficit if there is one, but again, you have to pay that back. Bond fund, this is the fund you would use if you have a bond issue in your district and you use it to record any tax receipts and payments of bond principal and interest. Special building funds, and this fund is used when you want to purchase building or land or to improve buildings. You cannot use general fund expenditures, but revenue comes from the sale of property, from bonds, from donations, or from tax receipts. And again, the tax levy for this fund is restricted. I'm going to have somebody else do the abbreviation for this one. The KC Puff. I don't know why that trips me up, but the Qualified Capital Purpose Undertaking Fund is used to address actual or potential hazards, accessibility barriers, mold. I don't know. I think catastrophic kind of things when I think of the KC Puff fund. General fund expenditures for this is not allowed. Somebody talked about using one of these or something. Was that you, Adam?
We've used it before for like building like HVAC upgrades and, going from old boiler systems to the more efficient ones where, it's like been 7 cents of our levy or different things like that.
And all these funds are really good places. Like, it says your TOSA says how much your reserves can be built up. Like these are good things to have places to have reserve built up, because so you're not pulling from your general fund. Like if you have something like that, you have to replace some heat pumps. If you have some reserve built in that QC puff, then you can use that instead of pulling out of your general fund. And so it's really important to make sure in these funds that we have those extra funds built up in there so we can pay for these extra things, and it doesn't come out of your yearly budget every year. You got to kind of plan. So
that's a great point, of having roughly 3 months worth of payments built into your budget and planning for that, of where you put money for, and a big problem that's happening across the state is less and less property taxes coming in on time. So you might be expecting X, but you only get Y, or you have those unforeseen costs of having that built in of where you put money, and putting extra money in those funds is a great point.
And it's a lot for like Elm Creek. 3 months of operating is 1.2 million. Like it's $400,000 a year. So that's a lot of money. And we're actually in a situation where like our tax payments might not come in time. And March is going to be a really tight, like that's going to be a really tight month this year, because the tax payments didn't come in as early this year. And, that's really based on if the farmers pay them early, get that early payment to get that savings that they get. And so making sure you have enough in there is a big deal in those reserves.
Cooperative fund, and this is one of the funds that we talked about that not a lot of the schools have, but it's used to record any cooperative activity between a school and any other public agency. And then the student fee fund, and that's a separate school fund that's not funded by tax revenue. And you specifically use that for monies collected for students' fees, which then have to be spent on exactly what they were collected for.
Well, Rachel did a great job of introducing bonds, but we thought it'd be important to take a little bit more of a deep dive on this. And Brandon, please feel free to jump in, because I know you've been through this recently. Bonds are traditionally used for more new construction. But the main thing that we want to make sure you guys know is that you need to ask for the correct percent, because it's paid annually. So make sure that you are able to cover your bills with all those sort of things. The district will receive a bond payment, let's just say booklet, a bond payment booklet that outlines all of this. And then bonds do allow you to go over that $5 levy, since that was voted on, that was a bond election. So Brandon, I know you've had some great experience with this very recently.
Yes, we just built a new elementary school, just kind of finishing it up right now. And so I think the big thing with bonds is making sure, obviously, they have to be voted on by the public to use. And then the reason we talked about the correct percentages, we had this issue in our district where the previous superintendent didn't look at the bond payment booklet correctly, and he added 2 cents, and it wasn't enough to make the payment for this year with the taxes we had coming in, adding that 2 cents. And so we had to add more into that. And so just making sure, I think the big thing when we have bonds is making sure that when you look at that bond payment book and when you're doing your budget, that you're asking for enough money to pay not just like we have a January and a June payment, that not just a January payment, but you need to make that June payment and then plan on like that next January payment. Like if the farmers don't pay the taxes early, like to make sure that you have enough in that fund to make those payments. And so just making sure that I think the thing here, if the first time you go through this, make sure you ask someone that's been through this to make sure you're putting the correct dollar amounts in your budget to make sure you can make your bond payments over that time. So
Good stuff.
So after you have all those documents down and you've built your budget, you've done that, then your superintendent will submit that in the portal. It's called the LC2. So this is obviously the portal, and log in, go to data collections, and then here is where you will submit your budget. You upload it, you fill out a couple cells, and it'll tell you if you have any mistakes. So if you are off on a decimal point, or if something's not adding up, or it'll tell you that you're all good. But this is something that you have to do. And anytime you make any changes to your spreadsheet, your budget, you have to re-upload it. So this is what you will do first upon creating that budget, is uploading it into the portal, into the LC2 document.
So we've talked about this multiple times, but the big thing we want you to take away from this is don't be afraid to ask for help when doing anything budgeting or finance. There's tons of folks, there's tons of resources. You should not feel like you're on an island with any of these. So Administrator Days always has a number of sessions dedicated toward budgeting and any of the changes that were made so that you can stay really up to date with that. As we've noted numerous times, things change every year. So what you've done in the past is maybe not how things are going to be done in the future. So they're really good about updating you with all of those. There's a couple of folks at NDE. I know the names Stephanie, Bryce, and Michelle that are more than happy to help with any of those. And then NDE also has a number of workshops in the summer as well. So we know this can be extremely overwhelming, but there's lots of different resources out there. One thing that I didn't put on this slide, but I probably should have, my superintendent actually has a consultant that he will call in sometimes, Carl Dietz. And so that's somebody that he's a paid consultant, but he'll come in and he'll help if there's any questions with things like that. So don't feel like you have to be an expert day one right out of the gate with this, that there's lots of folks that that are experts in this that will help you along the way.
I think that's both of my mentors said the same thing. The only people that fail at a budget are the people that think they know it all, or not, that don't reach out and get eyes on it, ask for help, ask questions. So I think that's really important.
So the importance of a good bookkeeper, which this kind of leads into what just Brandon said, was there needs to be clear communication. So that's coming from the bookkeeper and to the bookkeeper. If you don't communicate with them and they don't communicate with you, you're probably not going to get very far. And that is definitely different from school to school. We were kind of discussing before. So Norfolk Public has more than one bookkeeper, and that may not be the case at smaller schools. So Norfolk Public, we have a bookkeeper at the high school, one at the junior high, one at the middle school, and I think there's one general one for elementary. And then there's one that kind of oversees everything at the central office. But they definitely, that kind of even goes farther, is that they have to have clear communication with each other and kind of knowing going forward with things. So the bookkeeper should communicate with other employees and administrators. So there's a lot of things that change from year to year, kind of what we were all saying. And so the bookkeeper has to communicate that with the people that need to know. I do know that one of the things that came up this year that the bookkeeper had to kind of discuss was there were a few activities and coaching things that if you go and you have to eat out, the prices changed. And so they had to communicate that way the coaches don't spend too much money and then it has to come out of their check. And so that was something that the bookkeeper had to communicate and kind of talk to the right people. Trust, you need to know what they're doing, and that they're doing their job and doing what is asked of them. They should, as the bookkeeper, give out reports weekly, monthly, and quarterly. And that definitely looks different from school to school. Like I said, Norfolk has more than one bookkeeper. And so I do know that the senior high one, she does a weekly, monthly, and quarterly, but she also gives all that information to the head bookkeeper at the central office. And so theirs is going to look different than the high school one.
And I think, this main one was, what resources are there to help you build a budget? What do you print out and all that? Where those reports help you keep on the 8 1/3% of your budget every month. I mean, that's what everybody wants to go, is the 8.3%. And then also, if you get those breakdowns of, if you put $1 million into a certain line item, are you at 20% for the year, 30%? Are you on pace? Are you under? Are you over? I mean, a big one is always sub pay. You know, are you staying on track with sub pay, or are you not? Same with custodial materials. So those reports that you get printed out and have in that relationship help you keep on track with your budget.
And I think
And-
I just thinking about this too, how much more complex that is. Like in my district, the bookkeeper's right around the corner and there's one. And so just to think of the systems you have to have in place in Norfolk to make sure that the 4 different bookkeepers that are coding stuff are coding it so that it's coming out of the correct fund, going to the, it's not just as easy as walking around the corner and say, hey, how do I code this? Like, you really have to have stuff in place. So just, it really makes you think of, how lucky maybe we are in the small schools and how easier it is for us to
Well,
go
and
around the corner and ask the
we
questions.
definitely use the codes for the different schools. So anything that has like
Yeah.
coding for the high school, it has SH on it. And then the other schools have whatever they are. And I remember when I first started teaching at Norfolk, I always had to ask, like, what does this mean? Because I was completely confused about all the different like letters that came up on the top of things. But I do know that she has like a thick book about that big of all the stuff that she has to do before she sends it off to the central office bookkeeper.
And then making sure we go, I think the other piece of this too is making sure, like when you sit down, before your board meeting, you go through your monthly expenditures and you look at your, like you said, look at your line item expenses. To like a good bookkeeper is like, they'll catch it before you get to that, hey, we're spending a little too much money there. And so it's good to have those good people and those things in place.
So the other thing that's really important is being transparent. So one of the things with public schools is that you have to let your stakeholders know things. And so it kind of starts with board planning meetings. So that's where they kind of get together and discuss the budget and the reports of things. This does have to be public knowledge, and some of the different board meetings, depending on if they're voting or just discussing, those not only are public knowledge, people can actually go. Another thing is posting in the newspaper. So I think definitely people know that board meetings are posted always and what's discussed. But it's also law that you go and post about the budget and reports and all those kind of things. Another thing to kind of keep in mind, and I think Adam and Brandon for sure talked about it, is work with your surrounding districts. So watch what they're doing and see what's going on with theirs. Because in Nebraska, like has been discussed previously, a lot of different districts are helpful. And then have someone help review the budget. It definitely never hurts to have fresh eyes. So if you're kind of stuck, you can definitely have someone look at it. And they're going to come in and help, and they're not going to hinder things. So it's really important to kind of keep that in mind. One of the things that Adam talked about before we started recording is his superintendent was kind of stuck on looking at a part of the budget. And so when you have somebody else look at things, that definitely is helpful. And I'm guessing that's probably one of the reasons why we do have so many bookkeepers, is because they all have fresh eyes, and then it all goes to like the main bookkeeper at the central office. That way, they can kind of figure things out, and then they have somebody with fresh eyes that sees everything. And then this is just kind of a layout of being transparent. I think this is from Abby's district in Loop City. Some of the reports that came out in the newspaper. I definitely know at at Norfolk, we have a lot of stuff that comes out kind of like this. But these are just kind of how things are set up.
And when I talked to my superintendent, we kind of laughed because our newspaper here is, it's weekly, and you get a lot of the older folks that read through it for more of the, actually a lot of it's school news and community news. So it's maybe not the best way to get the entire community. But of course it is law, so we do it. But he said, just make sure that it's extremely public to everybody. So we post it on our social media sites, we post it on our website. We even have our marquee outside, and we'll say, you know, budget hearing, different things like that. So the main thing with this is that it's not a secret, it's not a closed door meeting, that since it's taxpayer funds, that we want to make sure that we're being extremely transparent and the community knows what things are going for. The last thing that I put in here were some helpful links. So if I was doing some of my own personal research, if I came across a site that I was using a lot, I thought, for me, and then maybe for everybody else, it's nice to have everything in one spot. So I did go ahead and put the NDE website for the AFR, the annual financial report. And there's a user manual for both the ESU and for school districts. So keep in mind that those are a little bit different. I did not include the master code list, but you can go to that same website and find all of that. It's just a download instead. And then the one that I used a lot was just the FAQs. That's always helpful for me when I don't have a depth of understanding on things. I'll go to the FAQs and just kind of try to understand the basics about it. But that's a great place to go when you're doing any sort of troubleshooting as well. So I always like to have those ready to go at my fingertips because when you're doing something like that, if you're anything like me, if you get frustrated, you want to give up. So I want to make sure that I have things super nice and easy for you guys. So team, anything else for the good of the cause?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, thank you so much for listening to our presentation. Have a great week.